Even a lot of campaign materials that Trump's using, they're all made in China, right? The biggest buyer and the biggest seller on earth, they can never really fight against each other and burn each other's house.
We have limited time, right? So we want to focus on stuff that I think is a hot topic right now, and that's what's going on right now in China, right? So you
Yeah,
obviously have this is what I'm getting, and I want to hear from you. You give me your perspective. I can look on YouTube and it says China won the tariff war and see 100 videos on that, and then another 100 videos that says U.S. won the tariff war, and it's like totally opposite opinions regurgitating information that they're getting from different sources.
yeah.
Like, what's the real story here? Who, like, in my perspective, I'll tell you after. I want to hear your perspective. In my perspective, it's clear that one side came out better than the other.
Yeah. That's a very interesting question, and it's also my pleasure to be here to share my opinion. I think both views that you saw online, they are somehow true. At the same time, they are also somehow political. Some of the accounts could be supported by US or China government to promote that they win, but this is politics. Politics is never about win or lose. It's about I take more profit or I take a better position. I'm like 60% winning, you're 40% winning. Not like I'm 100%, you're 0%. And that never happens in politics. It's always an art of balance and always an art of how um, do you comment on this? For example, India and Pakistan was in a brief war. After the war, both of them claimed that they win, right? But I didn't go into very details, but both of the parties claim they win because it's politics. It's the
Sure.
same thing with the China and US trade war. So clearly, US started this. I think for the current position, I would say probably China's is taking a little bit more benefit than the States because US started and US decided to stop it. In a way, um, I have to say US didn't win, okay, as a result. At the same time, I think China and US, their economic interest is tied too closely. It's very difficult for them to separate from each other. Even a lot of campaign materials that Trump's using, they're all made in China, right? The biggest buyer and the biggest seller on earth, they can never really fight against each other and burn each other's house.
Not
Um,
completely.
yeah, so if both party they are doing this trading, this is game theory, both are like positive 100. If both are not doing the trading, maybe China is negative 70, US maybe is negative 80. You can't say that China win that way because it's not doing business with US and I lose less. I don't treat that as a win. I treat that as a loss. And you can only claim that maybe US lost a little bit more. So I think overall, if Trump just increased the tariff by a little bit, US probably would take more benefits from it because um, this trade war, there's clearly no winner. If US really wants to cut the tie with China, what will happen is that the inflation in US will be huge, like to a level that nobody can suffer. Not anyone who vote for Trump can suffer. And to China, many people will lose their job. Their unemployment rate goes high, like taking the rocket. So no party will win. But if Trump just increased by a little, I assume that most Chinese companies, the manufacturers, they will digest more costs of that tariff um, applied to China. But now, since Trump increased the tariff by like 100 or even 120%, the profit margin for the Chinese manufacturing company is not that big. They can no longer produce. And once they decide not to produce and ship to US, in that perspective, US would lose more because I think US is a smaller government. China is a bigger government. When the inflation is so high in the States, people will complain. People will march on the street. People will protest. And the living cost in the States is higher than that in China. So I think if both parties are not going to do any business with each other, China will suffer for sure, especially the employment side, but they can sustain longer time because the lower cost, because the government does more, covers more of people's life to sustain. So from that perspective, but by the end of the day, I hope the world is peaceful. I hope that people do business with each other. Everyone can benefit. I'm glad that something happened, so that we come back to a stage where people are still doing business with each other.
So, but what happened? Like, if they just went back, what'd they do? They went back down to 35% and
So
10% or
China went
something like that?
from 109 back down to 10%, and the
Yeah.
US went from 145 back down to 30%.
So
US was
what
at
was the point
10%
of this whole
before,
thing?
but they added 20 before this tariff war. So now they're at 30 still. So in the end, it's a 90-day pause to figure out what they're going to do, which to me seems like, because it was US imposed, it feels like the US backed off a little bit. And just like Canada is finding new ways to trade. We're selling that much more energy to China now. We're making relationships over the pond in Europe again. We're looking at interprovincially. China did the same thing. They increased their exports to Africa by 20%. Their overall exports went up over the last quarter. They're doing fine without the US buying anything, really. It's just specific industries that were heavily exported to the U.S. right now we're struggling, but they also have 1 point something billion people to deal with internally. Like, do they really need the U.S. as much as the U.S. needs China?
Well, that's a
I
whole
think
other
both
story.
parties needs each other.
Yeah.
I don't see US become a manufacturing company anymore because you can only import one thing. You have to choose. You either, export. You can only choose between two things, which one you are going to export. The first thing is your product. The second thing is your money, your currency. Think about it. If you export your currency, people needs to send you product to exchange for that currency. And you can charge a what I call a currency tax because for example, smaller country, they borrow US dollars so that they can trade. And you can just US government can just print the money, send the money to the smaller countries so that they can trade and charge them an interest because they borrow US dollar. In that way, US is the largest country that export currency. And China, on the other side, it doesn't really export currency. It export um,
Product.
products like
Stuff, yeah.
goods. So China sell a lot of goods globally, and they collect a lot of currency like US dollars, euros, Japanese yen, and then they have to buy the debt of the specific countries so that their currency can still generate some profit. I think in a way, this trading relationship between China and the US is healthy. There's no way you can export both. If you export both, how the counterparty can ever buy any
Yeah,
of
who's
these goods
buying?
with you, right?
Yeah, who's buying?
Yeah. So they cannot just give you gold, right? I'm going to give you 1 ounce of gold to buy some currency, some goods.
Yeah.
That's not going to happen, right? There's only a limited amount of gold that can exist on Earth. So I think it's a smart position for China and the US to both decide on what they're going to ship. It's going to be worse off for all the other countries if both countries decides to export products or both countries decide to export currency.
It's a good, healthy globalization that we've experienced, and I think one of the biggest things that the U.S. has an issue with, and probably where Trump is coming from, in a lot of this, if you look post World War II, the U.S. was 50% of the global economy,
Yeah.
and now it's 25%.
Yeah.
So Make America Great Again is based on the premise of how to turn the US into a superpower. But it's not the same anymore. China is a superpower. They can't handle that pressure. They can't handle the fact that China's got the, second biggest economy in the world, probably growing to going to be the number one economy in the world. That's just something that happens, as globalization happens. But like you said, it
But
doesn't
they
mean
don't
that
want to
doesn't
not
mean that
tell
they
people what to do.
but they don't need to take over the U.S.'s position. The U.S. can still be the bully in the schoolyard, and as what Norman describes as exporting currency, while China is still going to be a major, superpower, an economic power that's going to be exporting products because it's
Yeah.
what the think about it. Energy
Doesn't
costs
work,
are lower
Darryl.
there. Energy costs are lower there. Product costs, labor costs. The Chinese systems, all their technology that they've perfected over the last 20 years in order to be able to build something. You can't just train Americans
No,
to
they're going to
build it.
overtake America. That's what America's afraid of because they're
They're afraid of.
better. There's more of them. They're growing. They're
But
getting
think about
smarter.
what Norman just said though. We can't have them be exporting currency and products, which I know what you're saying. It's
But
not
they
quite
kind
exactly
of,
like that, but I understand what you're trying to say
China
with that.
can though. But China kind of can because they've got this whole class of people. Well, a lot of them just became middle class, but there's still a huge class of people, like hundreds of millions of people that could become the buyers for their own currency, their own products. Like they could keep it internal, right? But then they have trillions of dollars at risk of the United States money, right? And so they're in this thing where they're tied together because they need each other so that it doesn't all collapse because they both have each other by the balls financially, right? They have so much of the United States debt that if they screw around too much with the states, that's a big problem for them because the states can just say, you know what? You're never seeing your money back again. Like, go screw yourselves. And here's the boats and here's the planes and who knows what happens from there. But they can do that, right? And this is the real standoff is like everybody knows China's going to take over at some point, but and the states is like we can't let this happen at all costs. We can't. So they go and they make like a deal with Syria and they unlock a whole population of buyers, right? They go to the United Arab Emirates and they go to Qatar and they make these deals because it unlocks like this new buying group, right? Because
But buying what though?
everything, everything, military stuff, technology,
But if you don't have
oil.
any products to sell,
What's that?
but if you don't have any products to sell,
Yeah, but
right?
they do. They have all that. Look, they just
They
made
have, I know,
$150 billion
but I guess
defense deal.
my point is this is what China does as far as the manufacturing side can't be replaced anywhere else. India, never gonna happen. India, they're, the
Trying,
no, India's
It's
never
not
gonna happen.
happening soon. I think India
trying.
has a moral issue with their business relationship. They've been cheating on a lot of international companies. That doesn't only limit to Chinese companies. There's U.S. company, Korea company. All these companies, like even Elon Musk, tried to open a store or open a manufacturing factory in India, and then he canceled that plan because of this issue.
Yeah, it's crazy.
No. But
Yeah,
I think all these topics, right, are all sort of part of like something that goes back really, really, really far. And I think
Yeah.
when like, you go back into like imperialism and stuff like that, like the England, taking Hong Kong and all that kind of stuff. China looks at this like, hey, there's a Western sort of power out there that wants to, like remember how there was like JD Vance was saying things like peasants and like they were talking down to Chinese and all that kind of stuff. They have like this image of like we're never going to give in. And I think the stance that the Chinese took to stick up to the U.S. because they're the only country that did. Every other country, including
and
Canada. Remember,
Canada.
No, Doug Ford said we're doing the power 25%. That was gone
Right.
within 24 hours of that.
Yeah.
We backed down. China was the only country that actually stood up to the U.S. and
I
fought for
think
what
Canada
was.
also fight back. Canada increased the
Yeah, we fought back with
tariff on
tariffs.
aluminum, on steels, and auto as well.
Yeah.
I'm not saying we didn't fight back, but the effectiveness of what we did compared to what China did, every other country gave in.
Yeah.
Canada, remember we get our own media's side of the story too. In the end, they're a superpower. They've got too much buying power. They've got too much control of what it is, and I think that China wasn't going to let that happen.